We are incredibly honored to welcome the first panel of the afternoon, Navigating Tensions, U.S. and Iran Relations in the Nuclear Age. We are pleased to have Dr. Sina Azodi moderate this panel. Before I introduce Sina, he wanted me to thank Dr. Milani and to also apologize for him being a problematic dissertation student, right? Okay. Dr. Azodi is a visiting scholar and professorial lecturer of international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on Iranian politics and national security strategy. He earned his doctorate from the University of South Florida, where his doctoral dissertation, Iran's Nuclear Program, A Struggle for Security and Modernity, traces the evolution of Iran's nuclear program. He's a frequent commentator on both English and Persian-speaking media, including BBC, Sky News, Al Jazeera, TRT World, and I-24. His analysis has appeared in Columbia University's Journal of International Affairs, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Arms Control Association, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I will now turn the discussion over to Dr. Azodi, who will introduce the panelists, facilitate the discussion, and lead the Q&A session that follows. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I wanted to thank Dr. Milani for inviting us. I want to thank General McKenzie for hospitality. We're grateful to be here. I have a few minutes of brief remarks, then I'll turn into the panelists, and then I'll ask them questions, and then we'll open it to Q&A. The history of Iran's confrontation with the US over its nuclear aspirations dates back to the time of the Shah of Iran, when the US, in the aftermath of India's peaceful nuclear explosion in May 1974, prohibited Iran from having the right to reprocess the spent fuel from its purchased reactors, a notion that the Shah of Iran and Iran's nuclear scientific community found to be in violation of Iran's sovereign rights and the NPT rights. Nevertheless, the US remained supportive of Iran's nuclear program and hailed Iran's energy diversification plans, although it had credible intelligence that the Shah of Iran is actually keeping a nuclear weapons option. After the revolution, the US shifted its approach by becoming a staunch opponent of Iran's nuclear program, citing Iran's gas and oil reserves. Washington, in fact, forced other countries to refrain from any nuclear cooperation with Iran, even when there was not a risk of proliferation of nuclear weapons. Since then, Iran and the United States have been at loggerheads over Tehran's decades-long nuclear aspirations. By early 2000s, and as Iran substantially expanded its nuclear program and technical capacity, the US imposed crippling economic sanctions, sabotaged the nuclear program, and issued threats of military action. None, however, changed Iranian calculations until in 2015, when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, signed between Iran and the P5+1, granted Iran limited indigenous enrichment capacity and sanctions relief in return for strict international monitoring and verification. The JCPOA served its purpose until former President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement and, in fact, prevented other signatories to the JCPOA from complying with the terms of the agreement. Iran waited for a year, and as now P4+1 could not mitigate the impact of sanctions, it began reducing its own commitments. Tehran then began its own counter-pressure campaign by leveraging its nuclear capacity in response to sanctions, acts of sabotage, and assassinations. We are now at a point where Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state that is enriching uranium to 60%, and its breakout time remains around a week, or less than 10 days. That being said, according to the March 2024 annual threat assessment of the US intelligence, Iran does not have an active nuclear weapons program. I share the assessment of our distinguished host, General McKenzie, that Iran wants to maintain a nuclear option while using its capacity to extract concessions in other fields. To discuss the issue further, we have a number of distinguished speakers who will talk more about Iran's nuclear program. To my left, I have Ms. Kelsey Davenport, who is the Director of Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she focuses on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran and North Korea, and on international efforts excuse me, to prevent proliferation and nuclear terrorism. She reports on developments in these areas for arms control today and runs the Arms Control Association's project assessing the effectiveness of multilateral voluntary initiatives that contribute to non-proliferation efforts. She is the creator and the lead author of the P4+1 and Iran Nuclear Deal Alert, a newsletter which assesses developments related to the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran, and the co-author of a series of 7 reports assessing the impact of nuclear security summits on efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism. Kelsey joined the Arms Control Association in August 2011 as the Herbert Soville Jr. Peace Fellow. Kelsey is a member of the advisory board for the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame and served on the advisory committee for the National Committee on North Korea. She holds a master's degree in peace studies from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. To her left, we have Ms. Barbara Slavin, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington and a lecturer of international affairs at the George Washington University, where she teaches a class on US-Iranian relations. Prior to joining Stimson, she founded and directed the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council and led a bipartisan task force on Iran. The author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the United States, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation, published in 2007. She's a regular commentator on US foreign policy and Iran on NPR and C-SPAN, PBS and C-SPAN. A career journalist, Ms. Slavin served as a columnist for Al Monitor, assistant managing editor for World and National Security at Washington Times, a senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today, Cairo and Beijing correspondent for The Economist, as an editor at the New York Times Week in Review. She covered such key foreign policy issues as the US-led war on terrorism, policy toward rogue states, the Iran-Iraq war, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. She has traveled to Iran 9 times. Ms. Slavin has served as a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she wrote Bitter Friends and Bosom Enemies, and as a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she researched and wrote the report Mullahs, Money, and Militias, How Iran Exerts Its Influence in the Middle East. To her left, we have Commander, retired, Dario Teicher. Mr. Teicher is a senior defense analyst specializing in countering weapons of mass destruction, arms control, and U.S. Central Command. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the State University of New York Maritime College, a Master's of Science in Telecommunications from the Naval Postgraduate School, and as a graduate from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the Joint Forces Staff College, and the U.S. Air Force War College, where he received a Master's of Strategic Studies degree. Prior to his retirement from the U.S. Navy, Mr. Teicher was a resident professor at the U.S. Naval War College in the Joint Military Operations Department. He was also a surface warfare officer, a joint specialty officer, and a foreign area officer. He served as the Naval Section Chief for the Military Group El Salvador and the Chief of Security Cooperation Plans for U.S. Southern Command, where he supported Colombia's military offensive against narco-terrorism and other security cooperation activities throughout the region. Mr. Teicher is the author of the decisive phase of Colombia's war on narco-terrorism. He contributed to the Homeland Security Papers, authoring the Colombian War and the narco-terrorist threat, and to the world's most threatening terrorist networks and criminal gangs, where he authored the Mexican drug cartels at war for control for the US-Mexico border. I now turn to our distinguished panelists. Kelsey, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sina, for the kind introduction. And I'd like to echo the earlier thanks to the Institute for hosting this important event, as I too have appreciated the dialogue this morning, and I hope we can continue it through this panel. So I'm going to talk about sort of three areas in my opening remarks. First, a little bit about the status of Iran's nuclear program, then transition to talking about how the U.S. has typically responded to proliferation challenges and why that strategy may be less viable now than it has in the past. And then try to end a little bit on a high note about possible options to mitigate nuclear risk with Iran going forward. So first, when talking about Iran's nuclear program itself, I mean, Iran is now a nuclear weapons threshold state. It has mastered the necessary technical capabilities and has a large enough capacity that it could move quickly to produce a nuclear weapon if the political decision were made to do so. And this shift to a threshold status is something that really has emerged over the past 3 years when, in response to the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iran has invested in new nuclear capabilities that have fundamentally altered the nuclear program and Iran's ability to ratchet it up quickly. And there are 3 areas in particular where Iran has expanded in the past few years that I think are significant. First, Iran started enriching uranium to 60%. Now, uranium enriched to 60% is not technically considered weapons grade. Weapons grade is 90%. But don't be fooled by thinking, 60 to 90, that's a big leap. It sounds like it, but it's actually not. Iran has done about 98% of the enrichment work necessary to get to that 90% enrichment. You can actually even build a bomb with 60% enriched uranium. You can sustain a reaction for a bomb. The design would be very unwieldy. I think Iran is extremely unlikely to go down that path. But this just illustrates how far Iran has come in advancing its fissile material production, particularly in the last 3 years. The second development I would highlight is, really since December of 2020, Iran has put a lot of investment into more advanced centrifuges. This allows Iran to enrich uranium much more quickly. And this is significant for 2 reasons. First, it can move more quickly now to that weapons-grade enrichment levels. But also, if you're Iran and you're thinking about trying to build a nuclear device covertly with an illicit parallel program, you need fewer machines to do that. So your risk of being caught diverting materials and machines is smaller because you'd have a smaller footprint that's necessary to actually get to that weapons-grade enrichment. And both of these factors are then compounded by the fact that Iran is allowing really the bare minimum of international monitoring and transparency as required under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Mostly, in particular, I would highlight there are key Iranian nuclear facilities that support the program, the places that produce the centrifuges, the places where Iran is mining and milling its uranium, where international inspectors have not had access since February of 2021. And that really increases uncertainty about whether or not Iran has diverted any of these materials for a covert program. And it raises questions about whether or not, in the event of a future deal, the IAEA would be able to verify that all of this equipment produced remains, within the peaceful program. It's going to be very challenging to kind of reestablish those baseline inventories. So because of these advances, Iran can now break out much more quickly. As Sina mentioned, the breakout to the first significant quantity of weapons-grade uranium would be about a week. Now, this doesn't take into account the weaponization timeline, which experts assess could be anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half. But if you want to reliably disrupt a country's drive to a bomb, it really is in that fissile material production window where you have the best chance to do so. Because once Iran has produced the fissile material for a nuclear weapon, it's going to do that weaponization process, at covert sites. And if Iran produces significant quantities for multiple weapons, diverts them to multiple sites, that just compounds the challenges in trying to track and then sort of disrupt that weaponization process. So the short-term proliferation risk is much higher than it has ever been. If you consider, breakout before the JCPOA negotiated was 2 to 3 months. Now we're less than a week. So I think that really highlights how the risk has shifted. Also, I said earlier, as I said, related to the monitoring question, there is also now an increased risk of diversion, right? Iran has a history of trying to develop nuclear weapons capabilities covertly, and has a history of failing to declare all of its nuclear activities to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So that again raises concerns. If we're not monitoring these facilities, do we know where all of the centrifuges are? Are we certain that Iran has not diverted centrifuges, for an illicit program? So there's much greater uncertainty around diversion. But also, as Iran has mastered some of these new capabilities, the pathways available for it to pursue nuclear weapons have shifted. So our assumptions about how Iran would build a bomb, the technical steps it would take, now are different than in 2015 in the lead up to when the JCPOA was negotiated. So what I'm trying to say here is that Iran's nuclear program is fundamentally different today than it was when we negotiated the JCPOA with Iran because of these advances. So as a result, Iran's nuclear leverage really has increased. And the proliferation risk has increased. And as a result, if we were to engage again in negotiations with Iran has more cards. Well, I would say the U.S. has the same and more likely fewer cards to play in trying to reduce nuclear risk. So that then kind of brings me to the second aspect of my talk. How does the U.S. typically respond to proliferation risks like this? And I would say the traditional U.S. approach is now much more challenging to pursue, particularly in relation to Iran, than it has been in the past. So generally, the U.S. responds to proliferation risks with a two-pronged strategy. First, the U.S. works to try to put pressure on a country to change course. This generally consists of economic sanctions, both unilateral U.S. sanctions, but also multilateral sanctions through the UN, and diplomatic isolation. And it pairs this coercive pressure, with the prospect of a diplomatic off-ramp. The idea of a transactional bargain that trades, restrictions and increased monitoring in exchange for relief from these coercive measures. And this is the playbook that the U.S. used, in my assessment, quite effectively in the lead up to negotiations on the JCPOA. But I think this approach faces, some fundamental challenges that will make it very hard to kind of replicate that pre-JCPOA strategy. First, if we look at trying to reconstitute a pressure campaign on Iran, it's much more challenging now, given geopolitics and tensions between the US and Russia, than it was in the lead up to the JCPOA. In fact, if you look at how Russia engaged with the United States and the international community, Russia even went beyond some of its UN Security Council required sanctions to put pressure on Iran. That demonstrates the extent of the unity that we saw within that P5+1 group in trying to push Iran to the negotiating table. That relationship is completely gone. The Europeans will not even entertain the idea of negotiating with Iran if Russia is at the table. And that increased relationship between the United States and Russia between Iran and Russia also gives Iran more options for sanctions evasion and for developing some of those networks that can sort of counter-effect some of the U.S. sanctions. So that's much more challenging. The U.S. also now faces a credibility deficit when it comes to negotiations with Iran. Whether you liked the JCPOA or not, I think it was an incredibly effective nonproliferation agreement. The Trump administration withdrew from that agreement while acknowledging that Iran was in compliance with its obligations. So in any future deal, we're going to face that credibility deficit, combined with the fact that even when the JCPOA was being fully implemented, sanctions relief did not live up to the expectation Iran had, what was envisioned under the JCPOA. So that then raises the question, can the U.S. credibly lift sanctions in an agreement? I think that's an open question that I think the U.S. is going to have to prove if we want to come back to this type of transactional bargain. So given these challenges, I think we have to think more creatively about how to address the nuclear crisis going forward. And first, I just want to quickly kind of rebut two narratives that I feel are taking hold in kind of the Washington discourse about how we can address the nuclear program. First, kind of in the wake of the protests after the death of Masa Amini, I think there was a lot of discussion that regime change is the answer to the nuclear crisis. Regime change is not a viable nonproliferation policy. There is no guarantee that the next government in Iran, even if it is a secular, democratically elected government, is not going to look at the nuclear capacities and say, we see value in a nuclear deterrent. I mean, democracies choose nuclear weapons as well. So this is not, like I said, this is not, a reliable pathway to remove nuclear risk. Second, I think even now we're seeing increased calls to use this period of tensions in the region, for military strikes against Iran's nuclear program. As General McKenzie said earlier, I think this would likely lead to a broader theater war, any type of large-scale strike. Any sort of smaller kinetic action, cyber action, this just leads Iran to further develop its nuclear activities, to harden its sites. And in either of these scenarios, I think there is a risk that kinetic action eventually pushes Iran to decide it needs nuclear weapons to defend itself against further attacks. So I don't see the military option in either of these scenarios as a long-term effective way to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. So that then kind of leads us with diplomacy. But diplomacy is going to have to look different than it did in the lead up to the JCPOA. The P5+1 is not a viable group. Transactionalism, I think, has its limits. But in the short term, I still think we need to think about some type of stabilizing transactional deal that provides Iran with some limited benefit in exchange for enhancing the monitoring of Iran's nuclear program. Like others have said, I don't think that at this moment Iran wants a nuclear weapon, but the risk of miscalculation is very high. As Iran continues to advance its nuclear program, it's so close to a bomb. The risk of us misinterpreting an Iranian move, the risk of Iran misinterpreting how much room it has to maneuver, all of that, again, sort of increases the risk of miscalculation. So some type of short-term stability package to reduce tensions and buy time, for a longer-term agreement, which I think is going to have to explore sort of a new paradigm. I think we're going to have to think more creatively about a more transformational approach on the nuclear side, and one that integrates, some of the regional nuclear issues that are also emerging. I mean, this session, of course, is about Iran, but the Middle East nuclear context is also much different now than it was in 2015. And a more regional approach could be an opportunity to address not only the threat from Iran, but also emerging risks from Saudi Arabia, which I would be happy to talk more about in the questions if they're interest, but I'll leave it there. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Barbara?
Thank you very much, and let me echo the other panelists. Thank you, GNSI. Thank you, Dr. Milani. Thank you, General McKenzie. Thank you, Heather Ward, for bringing us all here. It's great also to see a lot of old friends and colleagues. I'm going to try to build on what Kelsey very effectively set out, and that is to talk about some of the sort of short-term tactics that some are suggesting we use in the next year and a half, basically. Now, as Kelsey alluded to, we're coming to the end of an extraordinary multilateral diplomatic process with regard to Iran's nuclear program. The JCPOA was this process in total has been enshrined by multiple UN Security Council resolutions going back to 2006. In February of 2006, the IAEA Board of Governors first referred Iran's nuclear file to the UN Security Council. This was something that caused a great deal of consternation in Iran. I was actually in Iran in February of 2006, and the Iranians were furious that they were being singled out somehow for this international scrutiny and punishment when other countries had not been. Of course, this was a kind of belated reaction to the fact that the United States went to war in 2003 against Iraq on grounds of what turned out to be false premises, that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program or was reconstituting a nuclear weapons program. So it began a process of about 6 UN Security Council resolutions from 2006, going on through 2010, I think, when the most stringent UN Security Council resolution passed with heavy sanctions against Iran. This was supported by the P5, supported by the international community. As Kelsey mentioned, the Russians even went beyond the UN Security Council resolutions. China was fully on board during this period of time. And the process, I think, was very instrumental in getting Iran to the negotiating table to reach what became the JCPOA in 2015. The JCPOA itself was enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which was adopted on July 20, 2015. And in addition to restating all the elements of the JCPOA, the resolution provided for something called snapback, snapping back all the previous UN sanctions on Iran if Iran was found to be violating its commitments. And this was a very clever tactic. A lot of folks, of course, thought this would keep Iran from violating the deal because the way it was structured, it could not be vetoed by a UN Security Council member. There were also various timelines, sunsets, contained within the JCPOA. One of them was that a ban on Iran transferring ballistic missile technology would be in effect for 10 years. Sorry, not 10 years, 8 years. And that ban actually expired in October of last year. There are other sunsets, obviously, even though the deal with its strict limits on Iran's enrichment and so on would have gone till 2031 had the Trump administration not withdrawn. But Resolution 2231 itself expires. It is due to end in October 2025, after which, and here I'm quoting from the resolution, quote, "The Security Council will have concluded its consideration of the Iranian nuclear issue, and the item nonproliferation, in quotes, will be removed from the list of matters of which the Council is seized," unquote. So this is very, very key because Iran has long chafed at being singled out for its enrichment activities, its nuclear activities. Why me, they say. We've not built a bomb, we're members of the NPT, and yet the UN has singled us out. So we have essentially from now until October of 2025 to still operate within what is left of Resolution 2231. And there are calls, and there have been calls for a long time from certain quarters to invoke snapback. The Trump administration actually tried to invoke snapback to prevent the missile ban from coming off. But even our European allies basically laughed us out of the room saying, you left the deal. You're no longer party to the JCPOA. You do not have standing to invoke snapback. Now, Russia obviously isn't going to do it because Russia and Iran are closer than ever before, thanks to the war in Ukraine. China is not going to do it. China has not stepped up as a stakeholder in this. That leaves Britain and France as the only two Perm 5 members who could invoke snapback. Will they do it? I rather doubt it. I think the only thing that would get them to invoke snapback is if Iran actually went ahead and built a nuclear weapon. Between now and October of 2025. I'm not sure if Kelsey agrees, but I don't think they're going to do it absent that. It is clear, I think, that in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, increasing strains between the US and China as well, that we have seen the end of P5 unity and cooperation over Iran and nonproliferation more generally. Just the other week, as I was preparing to come down here, I noticed this very ominous piece in the Washington Post noting that the Russians, who had been very on board with all of these various nonproliferation regimes against Iran, against North Korea, including an expert panel that monitored North Korea's proliferation activities. In a UN Security Council vote on March 28, Russia vetoed an extension of the UN experts panel on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. At the end of April, this panel will go out of business after 14 years monitoring North Korea. So this is a very ominous signal. In addition, we see that the bilateral arms control process between the United States and Russia is also breaking down. All we have left is New START, and I believe the Russians are not even fulfilling their requirements under New START. which also expires unless it is further extended. So this is not a good environment for large multilateral or P5 efforts to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. What does that leave? That leaves a lot of ad hoc ideas, mini polar ideas, less for less, or as I heard it expressed at a recent track 1.5 I went to, different for different. I think Iran is still not willing to cross that line. I think the Iranians understand that they are getting so many benefits from simply being a threshold power. We have seen, of course, their axis of resistance and action in Gaza, and that has effectively deterred attacks on Iran, although not on Iranian personnel. So I think there is still space and time in the next year and a half for different. And these can be small tactical understandings about aspects of Iran's program. Brett McGurk, who is the Biden administration's Middle East envoy, met with the Iranians last year in Oman, and he met again with the Iranians in January in Oman. And I believe it was indirect, but there are also direct channels. There are also channels through the Swiss. And we can propose various measures in return for various concessions that are quiet, that do not have to be brought before the US Congress and scrutinized under the legislation that was passed when the JCPOA went into effect. It's probably the best we can do. And I want to say and concur with Kelsey that I was also extremely heartened by what General McKenzie had to say. General McKenzie, I thought you were a hawk, and I see now that you're a strategist. And you understand what US military or Israeli military strikes on Iran's homeland and on its nuclear infrastructure would mean. I think that we see that the program now is so dispersed. There are so many elements of it that we do not know what their status is. And in terms of Iran's domestic situation, which we've alluded to, the one thing that could unify this country behind the regime again, we saw it in the Iran-Iraq War, would be a massive attack on Iran with bombers that, of course, would have lots and lots of collateral damage, whether it's radiation that spreads and kills people in Isfahan or damages precious artifacts. It's not the way we want to go. It is a shame that we are where we are. It is a real failure that we were not able to hold on to the JCPOA somehow. But I don't think we should allow ourselves to give in to despair. I think Iran is still a rational actor that can be influenced with pragmatic incentives, and that we should exhaust every other option before we talk about the military option. So let me stop there.
Please go ahead.
General McKenzie, GNSI folks and fellow guests, I'll talk about what CENTCOM's role is and the various things we do to try to contain this problem. So I will tell you that my relationship with Iran, if I can call it that, I was a young 03 on a fast frigate doing earnest will tanker escorts a long, long time ago, in the middle of the 80s. And at that time, their Navy was mostly a bunch of patrol boats, a bunch of bog hammers, we call them, very little. And then a few frigates left over from the Shah's days. They have since grown. They have a lot of capability now, as you've heard from everyone. So we have to come up with a different solution. And what we do is we provide information and we provide plans, etc. So as you heard this morning, that policy gives you strategy, you get some objectives, and then you get to the tasks. Yes, we have plans to exercise against Iran under the correct circumstances. And Iran, will, as you heard, it will not be a piece of cake. Iran is 4 times bigger than Iraq, and we had a tough time with Iraq. So we don't have the means right now in theater because the world has changed dramatically, and we have other issues, higher priority. In addition to the planning, we do conduct exercises to maintain those relationships with partner nations, Jordan, Eagle Lion, and in Kuwait, Eagle Resolve. And additionally, we do smaller stuff, engagements. One of them is the Proliferation Security Initiative. The Proliferation Security Initiative was a George Bush II initiative that has a lot of potential to maintain relationships and build relationships. And what it is, at the workshop level, it gathers delegations, could be multilateral, bilateral, between at the strategic to operational level. We do tactical events when they want to demonstrate a capability and so forth, but the delegation is at the operational to strategic level. It's interagency. You have Ministry of Defense, and you have Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you have border, customs and borders, et cetera, through whoever has a role to play in counterproliferation. And so they would participate, and we do an exchange of briefs, but also a tabletop exercise. And the problem with PSI is that it is limited. We only have one delegation put together in Washington. They'd like keeping control up there. So trying to hit these countries several times to maintain that relationship takes time. So by the time we hit them again, it's new people. But it is a very low-key engagement to get into places like Central Asia now, where we don't have the same relationships that we once did with Russia. So our friends there, for example, Kazakhstan, we went there and were able to engage with them. That was only, I guess, about 2 years ago. So that's a tool that's on the table that we can employ to keep the door open with partner nations in the AOR. We have visited Bahrain, United Arab Emirates with this program. It's very useful. It can be linked to exercises as they do in the Pacific. We did a little bit of that with Eagle Lion, built counterproliferation into it. Maybe we'll need to do that more. By the way, before it escapes my head, regarding JICPOA, one of the things that we gave up is the additional protocol, because that would have stayed permanently.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to take my time to explain it.
Well, Kelsey can explain the additional protocol better than anyone I know. So yeah, when Iran had been observing it and then they stopped.
Yeah, because they were supposed to have JICPOA gone through its sunsets. The one thing that they were going to keep, they were supposed to keep, was the additional protocol, which allows the IAEA to conduct short fuse inspections and don't have to be in what they've declared. Under regular safeguards, they go, the IAEA has to go to what's been declared. So
the Joint Commission also expires, right?
Yes, to bring.
Which, among other things, used to have to scrutinize Iran's procurement of nuclear and missile-related technology. So that also goes away.
Yep. So it wasn't a situation where, hey, they're getting more than we are. It probably needed to be studied a little bit more. I guess that's what I mean to say. But other engagements, I'm part of a CWMD, Counter Weapons of Mass Destruction Division. My branch does planning. They were supposed to send the planner, they'd send the arms control analyst, but obviously you did a much better job than I would have. But that's okay, that's okay. For one thing, a lot of what they do is classified, so it makes sense. I myself, whatever I'm telling you, trust me, it's me winging it. So yeah, no, the planning they do is designed primarily to monitor Iran. A lot of that information goes up to OSD, and then from OSD over to State Department, who is the U.S. National Authority for Treaties. And from there over to, if it's the IAEA, it's Austria, for our delegation there to have information. I think it was in 2002 when info reached IAEA that, hey, Iran's got a nuclear program going here. And it wasn't until 2006 that non-compliance. That's right. So that continues to go. That continues to happen. The other branch, they do smaller scale stuff. So the particular units that need to have CBRN training and that sort of thing in the field, well, our partner nations there in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, they're pretty wealthy. They get the best on the shelf. But like Jordan, who's a very close friend, they participate. Kuwait and Bahrain and Yemen, Oman. Well, Yemen not so much. Oman. And what it is yeah, they'll build training packages, small training packages. Even if the nation is not wealthy enough, they'll even provide equipment for tactical level stuff. So anyway, that's what I do. But anything else? The operations we heard about. Yeah, we have a Prosperity Guard going on, and just recently, Inherent Resolve. That was I got to exercise that. Why? Because although in the field, the topic here is nuke. We are finding is remnants of chemical weapons. ISIS left a lot of stuff in the battle space. And every now and then we get a call for help to clean it up. Recently, we got that call. And the thing is, there's a procedure for who to tell when something gets recovered and eliminated and so forth. And so that procedure had not been exercised in a while. So I was doing the emails and all that. So I say, guys, this is what you got to do, remember? And they did. So that information is now in Washington, and the mission was accomplished. So as far as nuclear stuff, like I said, it's monitoring. And really, that's all I have, unless you guys want to hear sea stories.
Let me make a quick comment on what Kelsey said, and then I'll start the questions if you don't mind. You mentioned the regime change will not actually change Iran's nuclear program. And I must say, I started studying Iran's nuclear program when I was an undergrad student. And my reading of the program is that the regime changes have not fundamentally changed Iran's nuclear posture. We know now, thanks to the historical documents, that the Shah of Iran was secretly working on nuclear weapons designs. It was also pursuing fissile material production, although the US would not allow Iran to procure fissile material back then. The US would just say, you can buy it from outside. But after the revolution, they hated the nuclear program initially, but then they said, well, guess what? The nuclear program was not bad after all. So they started on almost identical nuclear posture. So regime changes, even in the future, as Kelsey pointed out, secular democracy will not fundamentally change the nuclear posture because the threat perceptions have not changed. But let me ask you, this is, I guess, for everybody, what could motivate Iran to pursue or translate its threshold capacity into an actual nuclear weapon? And what should the US do if you wake up tomorrow and Iran has tested a nuclear device?
I can start it. The CENTCOM AOR is a dangerous place. So Iran has Pakistan nuclear arsenal, and that arsenal is not restricted by the NPT in any way, a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Pakistan's not a member. Of course, India a little further away. They're also outside the NPT. And of course, to the north is the Russia and China to the east. So it's a tough neighborhood. They see themselves as well, a major power, a player. And so that is one reason that's probably driving them. It may not have anything to do with reacting to us. It may have something to do with reacting to Pakistan. They've had border skirmishes, and not too far. They've had a couple recently.
Can I add, of course, Israel has at least 90 nuclear weapons.
Right.
And one of the things that's been very troubling, I mean, there have been so many aspects of the Gaza conflict that have been gut-wrenching, but there have been threats by Israeli cabinet ministers to nuke Gaza, with Israeli officials essentially violating their own policy of never admitting they have nuclear weapons. But this kind of language, I mean, if I'm an Iranian and I'm hearing Israel threatening to use the nuclear weapons that it in the past didn't, even admit that it had, what is that going to do to my thinking about whether maybe I should go a little further with my program? Because there also have been threats against Iran that Israel would have to use nuclear weapons against Iran in certain circumstances. And I think this language has been very, very concerning. We have had comments from Iranians. Ali Salehi, who used to run the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, said just a couple of months ago that Iran had all the elements to make nuclear weapons. He compared it to an engine and having all the various parts to make an engine. So it was a not too subtle reminder to the Israelis or whoever else is out there that we too can build bombs. I think this notion of snapback is still a deterrent to Iran. I don't think they want snapback. I think they want to get out from under UN Chapter 7 and this whole UN approach to their program, which they see as a legitimate program under the NPT. I think they don't want a wider war in the region. I think they're content with what we're already seeing. So that's also perhaps going to keep them from crossing the line. I mean, as I say, they just have to wait till October 2025, and then there is no more UN Security Council Resolution 2231. What do we do if we wake up in the morning and they have tested? We will all be very upset, and we will take a deep breath, and we will go on and live our lives. India and Pakistan developed nukes, tested nukes in the 1990s. North Korea, only country to actually quit the NPT after the US pulled out of the agreed framework in 2002, stopped providing fuel oil that we had promised North Korea. They went on to build nukes. We didn't like it. We don't like it. But we didn't begin World War III over it, and I don't think we would do the same with Iran. It would be unfortunate. And we haven't talked about the proliferation that would necessarily occur in the region. I mean, Saudi Arabia is champing at the bit to get the fuel cycle from the United States or whoever else will supply it. Turkey could build nukes. South Korea has been talking about building nukes. I mean, we could see a proliferation spiral that would flow from an Iranian decision to actually build and test a weapon. So it's not something we want to see. But we'll have to live with it if it happens. We won't be able to. I don't think we can stop it militarily.
So, I mean, I already sort of talked about sort of one scenario where Iran might be driven to get nuclear weapons, and that would be in response to a serious attack on the territory of Iran itself. I mean, another scenario, and I'll admit I don't know what the response is to this, but if Iran saw a serious degradation of the strength of its proxies and partners in the region, would that change the calculus? I don't know. I think it's worth thinking more about. Another, we also talked about, regime change not being a nonproliferation policy. Regime change also can be a proliferation threshold. So there are certain scenarios where, in the event of the regime changing, it might be more likely to make the decision to develop nuclear weapons, particularly if it perceived its security as weak kind of vis-a-vis the region. So that could be another kind of flashpoint. Now, in terms of responding to a nuclear test, I mean, I think that is kind of highly unlikely that we will get to that point, because I think any intelligence that Iran has diverted nuclear material from a declared program is going to lead to an Israeli, if not a US strike, kind of before Iran could complete the weaponization process. But say we did, one nuclear test is not a nuclear deterrent. So it would be very important to determine then, what the rest of the weaponization, capacity looked like if we had concerns about other material. So I think that aspect, not reacting too quickly would certainly be very important. But I think there is more that the United States needs to be doing now to ensure that we don't get to that point. And that's not just engagement with Iran. Certainly I think Russia and China benefit certainly Russia, to a lesser extent China, from the collapse of the JCPOA. But I don't think either state necessarily benefits from a nuclear-armed Iran, in part because of the proliferation consequences that Barbara mentioned, in part because I think the implications for what that means for regional risk change. So I do think there might be space for the US to try to work with the P5 to think about and communicate to Iran where some of the shared red lines might be. Is that on 90%? Is that on withdrawal from the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty? Because if the Europeans do snap back sanctions, I think Iran will seriously consider withdrawing from the NPT. It has communicated that to the EU already, and I think the Europeans underestimate Iran's commitment to withdraw from the NPT, and I think the Iranians underestimate Europe's commitment to snap back if Iran sends missiles to Russia, right? So I do think there is a very kind of dangerous sort of flashpoint there. So I think doing what could be done to try to reinforce some of those shared sort of nonproliferation boundaries amongst the P5 in advance and ensuring that is clearly communicated to Iran, because Russia and China have more leverage in Tehran, that could be beneficial in preventing us from getting to the point where we have the nuclear test.
And let me ask a follow-up question, and I think it's time to open it to Q&A. As Dr. Milani pointed out today, the renowned historian Bernard Lewis wrote an article in 2006 suggesting that and the name of the article is actually August 22nd. And he suggested that on August 22nd, 2006, Iran would launch a nuclear first strike against Israel, because that's the anniversary when the Prophet of Islam, according to Islamic literature, was shown the heaven. And because, these, and I quote, the Mad Mullah theory suggests that these guys cannot be deterred, they're just going to launch. So I guess the question is, that was his suggestion. And so I guess the question is, can a nuclear Iran be deterred? Or let me ask it another way. Some suggest that nuclear states act more cautiously after they get the bomb, and some suggest that nuclear states act more aggressively. I'm a realist, so I tend to think, be on the side that says, nuclear states act more cautiously. What do you guys think?
Iran will not send nuclear weapons against Israel unless it's attacked first with nuclear weapons. I mean, Israel has 90 nuclear warheads and a second strike capability. Bernard Lewis got a lot wrong. He was a very good scholar of the medieval period, but not so much of the present day.
Go ahead, Kelsey.
No, I have to agree, because it seems the Iranians, what they're looking for is to be treated like we treat Israel. Everyone assumes they have it. So I don't think you'll ever see breakout, and I think it was said earlier, but you will see Iran gather all the pieces, like you said, the entire cycle. And these days, since nuclear technology has proliferated far and wide, you can just do business with Argentina. They have the entire nuclear cycle. Brazil, they've got it. And so Japan, et cetera. So they can get there. They're probably already there, like you said.
Kelsey mentioned one thing that we were talking earlier, and I remembered this from when I wrote my book, that Iran does not have enough natural uranium to really fuel, not just nuclear weapons, but civilian power plants. It has to import the fuel. And you were saying that they're trying to get it from Niger? This sounds like the old, conspiracy theory before the Iraq War, remember?
Yeah, so, to be clear, they certainly have enough nuclear material now for a small, limited arsenal. And if we look at the archival material that the Israelis, stole from Iran, I think it also supports this idea that Iran is very unlikely to ever use its nuclear weapons in a first strike capacity. A lot of the thinking, from that archival document suggests an approach very similar to the approach that South Africa took with its nuclear weapons program. That it would build, a very small arsenal and really only make it public or threaten to use it if, again, there was a nuclear threat directed at the state or a threat that was large enough to kind of threaten the very existence, of the regime. So I don't really see Iran engaging in sort of an offensive kind of first strike nuclear use because it's very well aware kind of what the consequences are. And I think whether or not it tries to use its nuclear deterrent to engage in any type of regional coercion is going to depend very much on how it sees itself vis-a-vis the region and how it also sees its nuclear capabilities stacking up against conventional capabilities. If we look at North Korea, for example, it's taken North Korea almost 20 years to get to the point where it has developed an arsenal where it feels like it has both a deterrence and a repellence mission, and now may be positioned to be more strategically aggressive vis-a-vis South Korea. In general, I really don't like comparisons between Iran and North Korea, but I say that just to illustrate that kind of it's not just whether or not they have nuclear weapons that is going to influence how it chooses to use those weapons for coercive gains. And regarding what Barbara said about Niger, I think this illustrates the fundamental challenge that we're facing now in assessing Iran's nuclear program and its nuclear capacities because of the limited transparency. When Iran was implementing the JCPOA, every aspect of its fuel cycle was under surveillance. There were so many places where any deviation could, trip concerns about whether or not Iran was diverting or breaking out. This was the strongest negotiated monitoring regime in the history of nonproliferation agreements. It was that thorough. Now we have lost all of that except the legally required access to facilities where nuclear materials are present. And nuclear materials, in the definition of the IAEA, doesn't even include the raw materials, right? Material doesn't come under safeguards until it's converted into a form that can be enriched. So if Iran is buying uranium from Niger and high-level contacts between Niger and Iran suggest that it's something that we should be concerned about. Niger has one of the world's largest uranium reserves and mines, right? So again, this just illustrates that there are things that Iran could be doing, from procuring the raw materials to manufacturing the centrifuges and diverting those, that we cannot see because the IAEA does not have access to those facilities. Now, I, of course, don't work for the U.S. government. I'm sure the U.S. government, through classified intelligence means, kind of is monitoring a lot of these aspects. But we would be so much better off if the IAEA was in these facilities, asking questions, following up, determining what Iran has produced and where it is, so we can provide greater assurance that Iran's program is peaceful, or we can be alerted more quickly if there is a real threat of diversion kind of through a covert program. So the monitoring is integral. That's why I think it is worth the United States trying to push on that issue now, trying to put something on the table that would benefit Iran, whether that's some limited sanctions relief, whether that's releasing more assets to the Qatar accounts, whether that's trying to incentivize something vis-a-vis China to enhance that monitoring, because it's so crucial to ensuring that if Iran breaks out, we know about it, and in trying to deter Iran from diverting anything for a covert program.
Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, I'm going to open it to Q&A. If you have a question, please introduce yourself, ask the question.
Little disheartened to hear the panel because my research
ma'am,
shows a
can you
little bit
introduce yourself?
different,
Sorry.
and it feels that we're more of a threat with Iran having the nuclear power than probably it was depicted on the panel. During the unrest in Iran, I had a chance to work with a group of data analysts that we did a lot of dark web reporting. And there was quite a bit of leaked information from the Iranian government that we found out. In fact, they had phosphate factories in Syria for enrichment purposes, and these were like unofficial correspondence. And our research also shows that the Russian scientists were working in Iran in collaboration with the Iranians to work on their enrichment for uranium. So I take all your points and I respect all your views. I know you're all scholars and I follow your work, but I think Iran depicts a larger, and it's not about Iran's right to have the nuclear power. I think the world or the international community is worried about a country that's not a democratic country. So they're worried that if Iran maybe was in a better international situation, and to your point, Barbara, where you said they're rational, I don't think, despite what they've done to the Iranian women in the unrest, I would call them irrational.
And what is your question, ma'am? If I may, what is your question?
Because the facilitators told us we could engage in, or collaborate in our difference of opinion, and I just wanted to
Yeah, no, sure. I wasn't
my
saying
research with you.
Yeah,
Thank
I don't
you.
think it's rational to make women wear veils, but I was talking in terms of their strategic decisions and the ways in which they approach national security decisions that affect their relations with other countries. They have been, I think we've seen certainly since October 7th, that they've been very calibrated in their responses. They have tried not to, unleash Hezbollah and so on, and in that sense, rational. Not that I approve of the regime in any form or fashion. And unfortunately, there are a lot of not very democratic regimes that have nuclear weapons. We were talking about North Korea, which has a really bizarre political system, led now in its third generation by the Kim dynasty. I would not feel comfortable with Mohammed bin Salman's regime having nuclear weapons. Not exactly a paragon of democracy. Pakistan's democracy is a little bit questionable. It's basically a military-run state. And even India is less democratic than it used to be. So, and Russia and China are not democracies anymore. China never, and Russia certainly not. So, it's a fact of life that there are problematic regimes that have nuclear technology and sometimes even nuclear weapons, and we have to be thoughtful about how we respond. In terms of Iran, feeling singled out, this is something, when I used to go to Iran as a journalist, Iranian officials would complain all the time that India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons and they weren't hauled before the Security Council. So why was Iran? Of course, Iran is a member of the NPT and they were not.
And a quick note on the issue of democracies and authoritarian regimes getting the bomb. Look, in 1964, when China got the bomb, China was the enemy of the United States. It was the rogue state. And when it tested the bomb, it actually started acting more cautiously. In less than 10 years, it normalized relations with the United States because it had the bomb. It was secure. Now, on the issue of rationality, there are two definitions when it comes to rationality. One is the cost-benefit analysis that states do, And second, as recently Professor Mearsheimer published on rationality, how states think. And rationality basically means that the political leadership agree on the necessity on a certain decision making. So that's basically the definition of rationality.
Great. Thank you for a wonderful panel. My question is about external assistance to Iran's nuclear and missile programs. I mean, I remember the days where you had Iran going out there and buying whatever it could from the likes of AQ Khan, the black market, and all the rest of it. The Syrians, the Libyans, the North Koreans, they bought anything they could get their hands on. But 30-some years later, where is Iran in terms of its needs? Because the issue of weaponization being the last obstacle came up. So where is Iran's in terms of needs to, if there's a leap they have to make, who might hold their hand? In this new global order we live in, Russia in '95, when the United States said to Russia, do not give those missiles to the Iranians, Russia said, yes, sir. But that's not the Russia of today. So are there countries out there that have what Iran wants and for geopolitical reasons might be willing to share that kind of technology that might be a game changer for the Iranian program, nuclear or missiles? Thank you.
I mean, I think we all know Russia.
Russia. Yeah, if you notice, Iran's relationship with Russia, especially with Russia's conflict, has grown tremendously, and I'm sure they're getting something for their UAVs, and that went north, and something had to come south. The problem with us trying to interdict anything coming south from Russia, it doesn't have to come by sea. It's the north-south corridor. So Russia would be the primary suspect. They may get it somewhere else. I mean, technology is there nowadays. The secret is out. It's out of the bottle.
Yeah, if I could just jump in too. I mean, I think in terms of Iran continuing to, scale up and possibly weaponize, one of the choke points is actually more in the raw materials space than in the actual technology space. And if you look at how Iran's, centrifuges, for instance, have evolved, I mean, in that aspect, it would be very challenging to seek assistance from another state. I mean, you can clearly see a domestic indigenized progression of advancement. But if you look in areas like some of the carbon fibers, some of the maraging steel, some of the ball bearings, that is where it appears that Iran might face some choke points if it cannot engage. And unfortunately, that type of assistance is much easier for a state like Russia to provide. And I think they'd be much more willing to provide that than some of the kind of more technical weaponization related aspects where it appears that Iran probably does have the domestic capacities. The missiles, I think, are quite interesting concerning because if Iran were to provide missiles to Russia, the data that Iran could get about performance, if those missiles were used, could allow Tehran to, significantly, refine aspects of its missile program. Because while it has used some systems, in recent years, the volume, for instance, with which Russia is using North Korean systems is providing the North Koreans with incredible data regarding, the accuracy and ability of these systems and the performance ability of these systems. That, I think, would be very valuable to Iran. I'm less knowledgeable about whether or not there are certain components that Iran might want from Russia in terms of missile expansion. But an area where I do think Russia could assist Iran and be willing to assist Iran is in the space program. And that, of course, has applicability to longer range missiles if Iran were to decide it wanted to pursue systems kind of beyond sort of the 2,000 kilometer range that it's pursuing now. So I'm concerned about the space element as well.
If I could just add one more bit. I mean, Iran has been a genius at reverse engineering all sorts of things. Drones, missiles. It's taken a lot from North Korea. It's taken a lot from the Russians over the years. And unfortunately, this is one area in which the Iranians really have excelled. I remember not so long ago when their ballistic missile program was still being discounted as not really very, very serious. There was a wonderful analyst at IISS, Mike Elliman, who used to monitor every missile launch and so on. He passed away, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. And most of what Iran was doing was taking old North Korean no-dongs and Watts and Scuds and, kind of reconfiguring them and trying to change the fuel and so on. A lot of their launches were disasters, but they just got a lot better at it over time. And their military relationship with Russia, of course, has really taken off since they worked together to keep the Assad regime in power. And now the Russians are promising them jet fighters in return for these drones, and they're also, they provided trainers, and there are persistent reports that Iran is or is about to provide ballistic missiles to the Russians. So U.S. denies it so far, but watch that space. What would Iran get in return?
Just a quick point. The Iranian thinking or the approach on the nuclear program is something simple that works. Starting from the enrichment and the IR-1, it was ineffective, but it worked. And I had an opportunity to look at the documents that the Israelis stole from Iran. And the weapon designs that the Iranians had in mind were quite simple. They were 10-kiloton bombs, implosion devices that basically worked for them. So even if they want to go for one, I think from the technical capacity that they have now and the designs that they wanted to have, I think they're quite capable of making one now. Of course, as Kelsey and everybody else pointed out, I think it will take time, but my understanding of Iran's nuclear program is that they have the technological capacity to make simple but working devices.
Hello, my question's in regards to cooperation between the U.S. and China in containing some of these Iranian programs. So you briefly touched on using back channels through allies and partners along with China. And there was actually, this isn't with Iran, but it's a similar situation. There was a CNN report that came out recently that said that in late 2022, the Russians were considering using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And the U.S. was basically able, through China, to convince the Russians not to do that. And then also Blinken has emphasized that the U.S.-China strategy, or his strategy, is that when we can compete, we'll compete, and when we can cooperate, we can cooperate. And so my question is, how exactly do you think we should approach Iran through the prism of the U.S.-China relationship? Because they have leverage. They brokered the deal to normalize relations between the Saudis and the Iranians, and there's a lot more trust between China and Iran than between China and the U.S. So how do you think we can use China to build trust with the Iranians, or to deter them from testing a nuclear weapon, or maybe technology transfers? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's very interesting if you look at Chinese statements regarding Iran's nuclear activities. And there are areas where they defend what Iran has done in response to the U.S. reimposition of sanctions, but there are areas where they do not defend Iran. And I think it is some of those spaces that we have to look at first. So in the safeguard space, for instance, there's part of Iran's safeguards agreement that it is not currently implementing. It's not giving the IAEA information about new nuclear facilities. The Chinese are not defending Iran's approach on this. The Chinese view this as an integral safeguards obligation. I think there's space to work with China there, but I don't think we can expect China to take the initiative. I think that the United States essentially has to put together a package that provides some benefit to China, some benefit to Iran, that maybe includes some of these safeguards, essentially give it to Beijing and say, why don't you present this to Iran? I'm not an expert on the region, but my understanding of the Chinese role in the Iran-Saudi meeting was that most of that work was done ahead of time and not by China, right? And I think if we watch how China has engaged on the nuclear issue, it sometimes will use its influence, but it's not going to lead. So that would be kind of my advice. Try to come up with a package and then allow Beijing essentially to take credit for it and benefit from it. this could be some, perhaps some exemptions when it comes to Chinese oil trade, significant reduction exemption letters, perhaps something in that space that would provide China with that tangible benefit that might push it to want to engage with Iran on some of the transparency issues. But I think transparency is probably the best space for Chinese engagement because of how they have kind of defended some of Iran's nuclear advances on enrichment, for instance. That would be my advice.
One additional point, our current relationship with China as it relates to Taiwan, that may make it a little bit complicated for them to support the USA against Iran. So perhaps in the future, but right now, most unlikely. Never know.
Yeah, well, we do know. I mean, Jake Sullivan went and met with Wang Yi and asked the Chinese to put pressure on Iran, to put pressure on the Houthis to stop shooting at ships, and we saw how that came out. The Houthis are still, banging away at it. So China has not really stepped into the space that a lot of us had hoped it would after it helped broker that deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. One thing we haven't talked about, and I think it's worth raising, Kelsey has talked about this a little bit, some folks I've talked to, the regional dimension. These are not countries in the region that really trust each other, love each other, but they do have some mutual interest in terms of, for example, preventing the Bushehr reactor from blowing up and spewing radioactive materials all over the Persian Gulf. There are limited steps on nuclear safety that have been talked about for years. Europeans have talked about this, IAEA, where you could begin to bring, especially if the Saudis are now going to develop some nuclear infrastructure, you could bring the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Iranians to the table with the IAEA and other experts to talk about nuclear safety and begin to hopefully increase transparency about where they're all going with these programs. They all have legitimate needs for, green energy. We all want to see the region transition off fossil fuel, and, this could be encouraged, and certainly it would be something under the auspices of the NPT.
Thank you.
Ron Weaver and I have a question about the appropriateness, if ever, of the nuclear threat. I believe Kissinger wrote in his book that he was authorized by Nixon near the end of the Vietnam War to use the term, Nixon is a wild man about to use nuclear weapons about North Vietnam, Kissinger wrote, and he relayed that message on just before that short-lived peace. In November of 2022, though, Putin said if Russia's sovereignty or independence are threatened, that he would use nuclear weapons. And then I think the G20 said it's inadmissible among the G20 to use or to threaten to use nuclear weapons. What are some occasions likened to an invasion of Poland, for example, where the threat of nuclear weapons would be responsible on behalf of any NATO country, including the United States? What would be an appropriate, necessary time when nuclear weapons would have to be used by NATO and the West, like invasion of Poland, or what would be your examples?
So I think you were referring to the dollar exploit that Nixon and Kissinger played to the Vietnamese, right? Yeah.
The madman theory? Well, first of all, it doesn't look as though Ukraine is winning the war right now, so I think the threat of the use of tactical nukes has pretty much gone away. We're in a situation now where it's more likely that Ukraine and Russia are going to have to agree to some sort of ceasefire. And I was talking to Armand, if he's still here, about him seeing some division of Ukraine, frankly, the way Germany was divided, which I hope doesn't happen. But that threat was based on the notion that the U.S. or NATO countries would send troops, would get much more involved in the defense of Ukraine than they have so far, and that doesn't seem to be happening. So I don't think you have to worry about it.
Good afternoon. I'm Colonel Eric Andresen. I'm the Canadian Senior National Representative to CENTCOM. Thank you very much for your presentation. So my question is about Israeli red lines with regards to a nuclear Iran and what their reactions to that might be. And then also I'd be interested in your thoughts on regional partners and how they see this situation evolving, and if, in their opinion, a nuclear Iran is as much of an issue as we might think it is. Thank you.
I'll do a quick one. So if you recall from years ago, the Prime Minister Netanyahu had this famous cartoon with the bomb, and the red line was, I don't know, 20% or some 60%, but slowly but surely Iranians have crossed that line. But from a strategic perspective, no nuclear weapons state would want another state to have nuclear weapons in the region. So Israel has nuclear weapons. I'm sure no Israeli government would want Iran to have nuclear weapons, not because they're just some crazy mullahs, but from a strategic perspective, it neutralizes their monopoly on nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure if they would decide to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon if they get the intelligence that Iran is actually dashing for the bomb. The problem with that scenario is, yes, you can bomb it once, you can bomb it twice, but once you have the knowledge to make the bomb, you can always make it. And you can't sustain an air campaign for months and months and months. They will eventually stop. So I'll just stop here, but for other panelists.
It's interesting how, you do still hear Israelis talk a bit about Iran's nukes, but they've been so focused on Hamas and Hezbollah that I don't think, we were all joking because it used to be that, the Israelis were tearing their hair out every 2 minutes about Iran, and now, they have many, many more pressing concerns since October 7th. So there may be some in Israel who want to widen the war, but I think the United States doesn't want that. I think a lot of Israelis don't want that, and I hope we can certainly keep that scenario from coming to the fore. Israel doesn't have the capacity now, and it never really did without the United States. It always would have required, and General McKenzie knows this better than anyone, would have required the United States to come in behind and bomb to mop up what the Israelis couldn't. So it's just not a feasible scenario now.
As you know, Israel has no strategic depth. So even without the nuke, the missile arsenal can destroy large parts of Israel.
And of course, Hezbollah would respond and unleash its 100,000 rockets on Israel if Iran's nuclear sites were directly attacked.
If I could just maybe say something on the red lines. I think there are sort of two challenges that I think with red lines currently with Iran right now. First, I think the red lines between the United States, Israel, and Europe are not the same, which is challenging to navigate. I think, to one sense, enrichment to 90% would be a red line. Diversion of highly enriched uranium, I think, could be a red line. Kicking out IAEA inspectors, I think, could certainly be a red line. I'm not sure if they did that in conjunction with withdrawing from the NPT, if that would be a red line or not in terms of triggering military action. But the other concern I have, and perhaps the more fundamental concern, is that we've seen Iran cross some red lines in the past, and there's been very little, if no response, right? So how does Iran perceive these red lines? And how strongly have they been communicated to Iran? And that's something, working for an NGO, I don't know. But I think, for instance, I think personally the United States and Europe made a mistake by not responding more strongly when Iran began enrichment to 60%. And, what does that tell Iran? How does that Iran think about red lines then and its ability to perhaps come right up to them? What does that mean? So I think red lines can have value, but I think also I have concerns about, how Iran thinks about red lines and whether Iran thinks that these are dotted lines, whether they're moving lines, or whether or not they are sort of red lines.
And any thoughts on the regional partners?
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, to the credit of the UAE, I think they have tried to engage with Iran on some aspects related to response and mitigation in the event of a nuclear accident or, act of nuclear terrorism, possible kind of response and on nuclear safety. So I do think that there is some interest there. I think there might be more interest if there was a technical research component to the nuclear collaboration, right? I mean, we talk a lot about Iran's nuclear program and the weapons risk, but Iran's nuclear program has a lot of very beneficial civil aspects, from applications to agriculture to medical isotopes. There is a lot of regional interest in those applications right now. Could you envision some type of perhaps regional tech center where there could be engagement on something like medical isotope production or better understanding how nuclear can be used for agriculture? I think there would be more interest there. But again, the tech has to come from somewhere, right? So you probably need some type of external support, whether from the US, Europe, or China, to get that process going. But if it could, like I said, I think the Emiratis would be interested. I think the Saudis would be interested. And I think they would see benefit in some engagement between kind of nuclear epistemic communities in the region, at that level.
Thank you.
One last question. Sir.
Hey, Matt Klaus from AFCENT. So I've heard a lot of individuals in this panel, as well as other panels, talk about Iran not actually wanting to get a nuclear weapon, but benefiting from like the suspicion of them having it. So if they actually don't want to, and that was the focus of JICPOA, was to get them to not get something that they don't actually really want to get, do you think they would have been open to an alternative of, say, stop supporting Iranian-aligned militia groups with advanced conventional weapons, or the production of long-range ballistic missiles? Do you think they would have been open to something like that? And what might have been the second and third order effects of that? Or do you think they would have not been open for that?
I mean,
I don't think so. I mean, Iran has been subjected to arms embargoes of one sort or another for a very long time, and Iran's response has been to build up its missile forces and to build up its relationships with various proxies and so on. No, I mean, and the Iranians have said over and over that their missiles are their crown jewels. So the JCPOA was limited to trying to make it impossible for Iran to build a nuclear weapon for a very long time without being detected. And we will never know if it would have succeeded because we left the deal. But there can be understandings about other issues, but Iran is not going to negotiate away its ballistic missiles.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that understandably, because some of Iran's ballistic missile development, was, with the intent of being able to pair with a nuclear warhead, sort of pre-2003, there is that tendency to tie the nuclear and the missile together. But, I think the missile program now has clearly become about the region and deterring the region, and is really less tied to the to the nuclear program. So I think, the missile negotiation, I personally think, has to be done in the region. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for other countries to support that dialogue, but I don't see the trade-off there.
Yeah, just briefly, I think the Iranian leadership, being the Shah, being the Ayatollahs, they strongly believe that their neighbor would not treat them well if they give up on their national defense posture. So I don't think this will happen. They don't think that international norms matter that much. So as long as you have the missiles, nobody can attack you, so you're safe. If you give up on the missile program, then your neighbors will not be that nice to you. Thank you.
Let's thank the panel for that incredibly thoughtful discussion.